present. We're getting recorded too. The book is titled Terror in Transition, Leadership and Succession in Terrorist Organizations, the Columbia University Press book of this year. And we have two outstanding authors and presenters, and I will help sort of moderate and deal with questions. My name's Joe Young. I'm a professor at American University. But the first most important person to introduce you to is Tricia Bacon, who is a PhD and is an associate professor in American University School of Public Affairs. My favorite colleague, but everybody else don't listen to that. And she directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub at American University. Dr. Bacon is also the author of the 2018 UPenn Press book, Why Terrorist Organizations Form International Alliances. I have a signed copy of that one, by the way. And she's published articles on terrorist group alliances, terrorist group leadership, terrorist safe havens, and other related topics. Before Professor Bacon came to American University, she worked on counterterrorism for over 10 years at the Department of State. And her work on counterterrorism, the intelligence community received numerous accolades. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it also made it onto the Presidential Daily Brief. And she conducted research and analysis on counterterrorism with a focus on South Asia and Africa. And Dr. Bacon is a non-resident fellow at George Washington's University program on extremism, as well as a journal editor for all the major terrorism journals, on the editorial boards of those. All right, and our other important presenter today is Professor Elizabeth Grimm, who's an associate professor of teaching in the Security Studies program at George Washington University. She's the author of the 2017 Columbia University Press book, Lawyers, Policymakers, and Norms in the Debate on Torture, my favorite topic. She's won numerous awards. I think maybe the most impressive thing is that she's received the School of Foreign Service Faculty of the Year of Award in 2012 and in 2020. I've not heard of people winning that award twice. So that says something about Professor Grimm. And she also received her PhD in government from Georgetown, MA in security policy studies from George Washington. And like Professor Bacon, she has also worked in the defense and security sectors of the US government. So with that introduction, we would love to hear about the book. I'm very excited. And if folks have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them after the talk and we'll have a discussion around things that are exciting and interesting about the book. So Professor Bacon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm mostly glad that it was recorded that he said I'm his favorite colleague, so I'm going to be able to point to that evidence at a later time when I need it. But thank you to Professor Young for moderating our talk today. Thank you to SPA Events, especially Lisa Manning, for organizing the event. And I don't know if I was able to trick you with my screen grab behind here, which is fall on AU campus, but it's good evening for me here in New Delhi, where I am this semester conducting research. So I'll be very glad to see a lot of the participants that are here today in person very, very soon. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Is it showing up as the slide, as the presentation? All right, rock and roll. So as Professor Young indicated, Liz and I, Dr. Grimm and I had a book come out this fall while I was here in India. So we're excited to do a virtual book launch for American University and to do an in-person launch when I return early next year. So what I want to talk to you about is sort of the core components of the book, is why we're looking at leadership in terrorist organizations, and then hone in on the things that we found about founders of these organizations and the different successor types we identified for these organizations, talk a little bit about the case studies we did, and then turn to our findings. So this project goes back a number of years for both of us. In fact, I think the genesis of it was when we looked at the split between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Liz and I had the question for ourselves is, would the split still have happened if Al-Qaeda's founder, Osama bin Laden, was still at the helm of the organization? And it was sort of a counterfactual exercise. And we looked at the differences between bin Laden as the founder and his successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and sort of explored this question. And in so doing, what we realized is there's a big literature on leadership, but it's at two ends of the spectrum. There is a very large leadership decapitation literature, a lot of research, a lot of important research done on the effects of losing leaders of terrorist organizations. And then there's a lot of really in-depth work on individual leaders like Osama bin Laden. But there's not a lot of work that sort of branches across these two literatures. So we wanted to take a look in more depth about the role of leaders in these organizations. And in particular, what is the role of a founder? And then how should we be thinking about successors and the different types of successors? And one of the things that we avoided in these questions was these debates about effectiveness. There's a lot of debate about things like effectiveness, or very hard to measure things like charisma. And we wanted to step back and provide this more foundational look at leadership in these organizations. And the very first thing that we did really harkens back to what we were looking at when we were examining Osama bin Laden, which is the role of a founder in a religious terrorist organization. And what we argue is that essentially founders provide the foundation for organizations. They are the ones who establish what we kind of simplify to say the how and the why of these organizations. In order for people to join an organization that is a lot of times covert or clandestine or illegal, or is undertaking violence in the name of religion, there has to be a compelling reason why. And founders are the ones who provide this foundational explanation for why a group needs to undertake the cause. And then they also establish the how. And for those of you who've done work on social movement literature, you'll see the parallels here, which is we define these very close to how people look at social movements more broadly. And the how is the tactics. And that doesn't just mean violence. It certainly does mean violence in the cases we looked at, but it doesn't always just mean violence. These can be other tactics as well as how does a group mobilize people to join the organization, to support the organization, to provide funding for the organization. And founders we looked at as a baseline as the first leader as long as they led for 1 year. If the initial leader was killed before 1 year or stepped down or whatever, we looked at then the first leader who lasts at least 1 year in the organization as providing this foundation. And they can change these things over the course of their leadership. They're not fixed, they establish them once, but the degree of narrowness or broadness that the founder creates kind of establishes the baseline for how much movement a successor can undertake in their subsequent leadership.
So I'm going to take over for the next couple slides, and I'm grateful to Dr. Bacon and also to Dr. Young for that introduction. I can safely say I've never been at a book talk where someone describes someone else as their favorite colleague, but I'm glad that I've been a witness to that today. But so just to pick up where Dr. Bacon left off, the question for us is not simply who the successor is, but the way that they lead. And by that I mean, will they continue to lead the organization in the same manner as the founder? Or will they take steps to change that why and the how? And so over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about the choices available to the successor, and then also what the impact of CT pressure has. We argue that the change that the successor takes can take two forms. The change can either be incremental or the change can be discontinuous. Now, incremental change, these refer to changes that don't really alter a group's fundamental nature. They don't upend the existing how and why. They basically fall within the normal evolution of a group. Whereas discontinuous changes, they refer to the introduction of a change that transforms the group, that is disruptive. So Dr. Bacon, if you can go to the next slide. And so what we think about here for successors, when we talk about incremental versus discontinuous changes, again, incremental changes, these are consistent with the how and the why. But they're still adapting to environmental realities or organizational realities. And so what does this actually look like? So an incremental change to the why, for example. And remember, the why is the sort of the reason for being, the more than the mission, the sort of reason that the group has chosen this path. An incremental change on the framing. Well, this could look like highlighting recent actions taken by their adversary in order to discredit them. It could like condemning new forces that are entering the conflict, but it is still ultimately consistent with what the founder would have chosen. An incremental change in the how could look like increasing the use of one tactic that they had already chosen, but just sort of increasing it. It could look like, for example, increasing resource mobilization, going to increasing a new method to garner funds. Now, we want to talk, though, about discontinuous changes. And discontinuous changes, these are game changers. These are radically upending the how or the why, or sometimes both, that the founder had created. So a discontinuous change to the why, this could emphasize a new adversary as the new primary enemy. A discontinuous change to the how, this could look like, adopting a political party, adopting a new tactic and having that become the primary tactic. It could look like conducting operations in an entirely new place. So if we want to go to the next slide, I'll talk about what role CT pressure has on all of this, because CT pressure is sort of layered on both of these factors, layered on the founder and then the choices that the successor makes, is this recognition that the level of CT pressure significantly influences a successor's decisions. It can significantly influence their leadership type by shaping the operating environment that that group is operating in. And so we looked at CT pressure as effectively ranging on a spectrum from low to high. Now, on a low end, groups that are facing low CT pressure, they have the freedom to undertake their core activities. And so what does this look like? Fundraising, training, communications, recruitment. They can undertake these core activities without any fear of counterterrorism action against them. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have high counterterrorism pressure, right? And leaders' roles may change in spaces in which they're experiencing high CT pressure. And what this means is that in a high CT pressure environment, the group is existing in constant fear of betrayal. They're existing in constant fear of disruption, of detection, or they may be frequently warring with their enemies. One of the reasons that we have the picture of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad up here is we studied them in an in-depth way in our case studies, but the Egyptian Islamic Jihad is a great case study for looking at the impact of CT pressure. Because on one hand, they faced incredibly intense high CT pressure at home within the Egyptian state, but less CT pressure abroad. And as Dr. Bacon will talk about later, we deliberately chose cases in which we had variation on the level of CT pressure that the groups faced. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about how all of this maps together. So the interaction of these factors, meaning incremental or discontinuous changes relative to the founder's how and why, we found, and our argument is, that it produces 5 different successor types. And so I'm going to walk through all 5 of these types to lay the groundwork for what our argument is, what our story is here. When you have a successor who makes only incremental changes to the why, that's the framing, and only incremental changes to the how, that is a caretaker. This is a leader for whom authority and prestige tend to be passed down. This is a leader who is largely keeping things relatively stable to what the founder would have wanted. The second type of leaders that we studied are leaders who are making discontinuous, or again, remember those dramatic disruptive changes to the framing, to the why, but they actually make incremental changes to the how, to the tactics and resource mobilization. And so what this could look like is, for example, a pledge of affiliation to another group, such as Al-Qaeda, such as the Islamic State. Then we have fixers. So fixers are only making incremental changes. Incremental changes to the why, but they make dramatic discontinuous changes to the how. And so what this looks like is that they are changing dramatically some aspect of the tactics or some aspect of the resource mobilization. And so what this could look like is that fixers could introduce never before used tactics, such as introducing women as suicide bombers or introducing improvised explosive devices. It could be looking to an entirely new avenue for raising money. Then we have, my friends, the visionary leaders. Visionary leaders make disruptive, discontinuous changes to both the how and the why. And so what does this mean? This could look like proclaiming the formation of a state and then introducing governance within the state. These are disruptive changes from what the founder had originally scoped, from what the founder had originally intended. And the last category, and I have to admit, we added this pretty late in the writing of the book because we wanted to acknowledge that there were cases in which successors are not actively choosing either change or continuity. We wanted to acknowledge that there are cases in which a leader exists, but they are either unable or they are unwilling to make key decisions for that organization. And so that's why you'll note in the block that it says leader is absent. So we don't really see changes to the why or changes to the how, because this is a period, quite frankly, of silent leadership. In the course of our research, we found that there were many reasons for this. There could be instances of very severe health problems. There could be instances of imprisonment in which the leader is actually unable to direct operations from prison. And so with that mapping out of our founder setting the how and the why, and the ways in which every successor positions themselves relative to the founder, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Bacon to talk about the case studies that we looked at.
So what we did at this point was we really tried to establish the universe of cases that this would apply to. And so we established that we're only looking at organizations that had an instance of succession, that were organizations that had a religious ideology. So it wasn't enough that they were comprised primarily of a certain religion. It had to have a certain element of religion in the ideology. These had to be organizations that conducted at least 10 terrorist attacks, that had at least 50 members, and it had existed for at least 2 years. So there was kind of a minimum threshold, as well as the need for a successor. And we looked back about 100 years so that we could establish this universe of cases. And then we looked at the organizations, and what we wanted to do was pick organizations that had an array of circumstances, that experienced an array of counterterrorism pressure, that existed over different geographies, that existed across different religious orientations, and had founders who ran the organization for different lengths of time. And we settled on these 4 cases: Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Second Ku Klux Klan, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Al-Shabaab. And we looked at them and we interrogated this process of founders establishing the baseline and then the successors that followed them. And in the Egyptian Islamic Jihad case, we had a relatively short-lived founder, just 2 years. And he established a very specific vision of wanting to undertake an overthrow of the Egyptian regime through a coup. And so it was a very elite way of overtaking the state. And it involved, of course, the assassination of Sadat, which backfired catastrophically for the organization and produced an environment of very high counterterrorism pressure, and thus produced 2 figurehead leaders who were either in prison or were essentially overseas in a way that they could not run the organization. And this case in particular, I think, reveals a lot and is particularly informative when we even start to talk about Al-Qaeda. Because then what we have is Ayman al-Zawahiri, who would later become the leader of Al-Qaeda, take over the organization. And the examination of him in particular as a leader really starts to shift the focus away from personality, which is a lot of the focus on the work on leadership. And what we look at is, what kind of leader was Zawahiri? And one of the things that he did when he first took over as the leader of the organization was he tried to be a fixer. He tried to adjust the tactics that the organization would use in order to implement the founder's vision of overthrowing the state. But the organization floundered. It experienced significant backlash from the public. It was divisive within the organization. Briefly, we had a caretaker come back into this organization, try to get it back on the founder's original blueprint, but it was too late. So then Zawahiri comes back into the picture as a leader, and this time he's a visionary. He aligns his organization with Al-Qaeda. He moves away from the cause against the Egyptian government, and he essentially completely reorients the organization, what was left of it at this point. And again, he's a very interesting case because when he takes over as leader of Al-Qaeda a number of years later, he's a different kind of leader. And it does reflect that there are characteristics that change that aren't based on personality. And then we looked at Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is sort of a famous founder of all the founders, especially in the Sunni jihadist movement, and the vision that he established. And he, in getting to where he was as the founder of this organization, he went through a pretty significant journey himself. But the successors that came after him, especially the first 2 that came after him, are often derided as sort of ineffectual leaders or that led the organization into disarray. And again, what we do is shift the focus here, and we identify them as signalers. What they did was declare a state. They didn't have the trappings of a state. They declared it. It was a new framing for the organization, that they weren't just Al-Qaeda's branch in Iraq. This organization was now going to be the state in Iraq, and also minimized the public affiliation with Al-Qaeda. So we had these 2 signalers who, of course, then set the groundwork for the visionary who was to come in Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And then in Al-Shabaab, we have a pretty long-standing founder. We have a founder who was the head of the organization for about 7 years, who really took the organization through quite a tumultuous time, including a pretty brutal weeding out of those who challenged him. And I really expected in this case to find a caretaker who would follow in such a decisive founding leader. But interestingly, in this case, the successor he even anointed was originally a fixer. He introduced new tactics to the organization, in particular overtaking the forward operating bases of the African Union, including a plot to hijack a plane and fly it into a building in the United States, which is, of course, a very familiar plot to many of us. But then this same leader became a figurehead when his health issues became worse, when the counterterrorism pressure became worse, he shifts into this kind of role. And then Liz looked really in depth at the second Ku Klux Klan in particular, which is a very different case than the other three that we looked at, but still consistent with our argument.
Absolutely. So the rationale for the inclusion of the second Klan, and by this, I mean, this is the version of the Klan that was active from 1915 to 1927. Dr. Bacon and I wanted to include this case for a number of reasons. And one is that we wanted a somewhat older case, right? We wanted a case that sort of stretched back in time. We wanted a case to reflect geographic diversity. So we wanted a case that existed in the United States. And also I would say it was important for us to examine a case of succession in which the leader was overthrown, because quite frankly, for us, that represented an outlier in our cases of examining religious terror organizations. The overarching point to say about the second Ku Klux Klan as well is that this is a leadership transition in which, and I cannot stress this enough, this was an ecosystem of zero counterterrorism pressure. And so for us, it existed on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, for example, than an Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that for the duration of its existence existed in intense counterterrorism pressure. And so for this case, we studied two leaders. So the second Klan's founder was a man named William Joseph Simmons, and his successor was Hiram Wesley Evans. And then again, under these two imperial wizards, and I cannot stress this enough, the Klan operated with near complete impunity, very rarely facing legal consequences for their violent operations and for their campaigns of intimidation. And this culture of permissiveness was so widespread that it included integration with local law enforcement, even elected officials. And so in forging the mission, in forging the why for the second Klan, what Simmons did was that he drew on the long legacy of violent white supremacy in the United States. And as the founder of this organization, what he really exploited was a growth, of sort of an explosion of nativist sentiment, and also sort of boom in fraternalistic culture existed at this time around the turn of the century. I said, however, that this is a compelling case because this represents a case of an overthrow. And so Hiram Wesley Evans, he ascends to the role of imperial wizard after an organizational coup, largely because of the mismanagement of the first imperial wizard, largely because of Simmons' mismanagement. And he then operates as a fixer. He ushers in a series of reforms to move the Klan into two new spaces that I actually think are particularly notable for the current ecosystem that we are living through as well, to seek to move the Klan into electoral politics and to seek to move them into a platform of embracing educational reform. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Bacon.
So as I discussed originally, we established the universe of cases that would apply into our argument. And as you'll see here, as you start to think through which organizations you are thinking of that are not on the list. As I say, that there were some key criteria, especially they had to undergo a case of succession. There had to be a minimum viable organization. They had to be a religious organization. And there were some cases where there just simply wasn't enough information on the leaders. So this represents the other cases, the other 29 cases. And so what we did at this point was say, okay, we did these in-depth case studies. We've developed these types. How does this look when we examine these other 29 cases? And we did what we call mini case studies of them to see were there unidentified leader types? Do these types not apply in these other cases? And what we found was, especially when you look at the first level of succession, from the founder to the first successor, the vast majority that we saw, or maybe not the vast majority, the majority that we saw were caretakers. And I think this is a pretty important thing to acknowledge, that oftentimes when you have a founder, they take up so much of the leadership oxygen that it's hard for somebody to come in right after a leader and make significant changes, to have the same level of presence. So in most cases, we saw this tendency towards conservatism, especially in the first leadership succession that an organization experiences. And as I say, these are the initial successors are often derided as lacking the charisma or lacking the dynamism of the founders. But some of that may very well be a function of this process of succession. And as Dr. Grimm talked about, in these cases of stepping down, when a leader actually relinquishes authority, it's probably no surprise in every one of those cases we see a caretaker emerge. People don't tend to want to step down unless they're pretty confident their wishes will be implemented. But also in cases when leaders were killed or died, this is the primary type that we saw. The next most common was the fixer, and this is across all the other ways that you lose a founder except the stepping down. We see fixers emerge as the second most common, followed by signalers, those who are just changing the framing. And that was in cases where both leaders were killed or when they were overthrown. They make those kinds of changes. And then the visionaries and the figureheads were about equal in terms of this initial succession that we observed. But overall, when we're talking not just about the first succession, but all the successions, what was interesting is we found caretakers and fixers emerged about the same amount of time. So we looked in total at 112 successors that came out of 38 founders originally. Some organizations had more than one founder, so that explains the discrepancy between the number of cases and the number of founders. And I think one of the things that this tendency towards caretaking reflects is that organizations, once they establish these foundations, they are slow to change them. It doesn't mean they won't change them, but it is probably the status quo is the easiest, the incremental changes to the how and why. But equally common was the fixer, which suggests that changing tactics is something that organizations can also do. These discontinuous changes to tactics is something that organizations can also do with an equal amount of capability. But changing the framing and just the framing was actually pretty uncommon. And it was overrepresented in the case studies that we looked at. It was actually quite rare. More common, and to our surprise, was that a leader would change both. If they were going to change the framing, they were also going to change how it was pursued. And so in about 19% of the cases, we saw these much more dynamic leaders who are willing to change the how and the why, which can be the thing an organization needs to revitalize and can be the thing that breaks an organization, because that kind of change can experience a lot of internal resistance. But I think the biggest surprise for us was that there was relatively few figureheads. And once again, they were overrepresented in the in-depth case studies we did. It was only 7% of the time. And we would fully concede that sometimes it is hard to assess the role of leadership in these organizations. They are clandestine organizations after all. But given the prevalence of leadership decapitation, I think both of our expectation was figureheads would be probably about on par with caretakers in terms of how we would see the distribution of leadership. So I think that was one of the most surprising findings for us when we looked at this total of the 33 organizations. And Liz will talk about some of the leadership decapitation implications.
Absolutely. So just as Tricia said at the beginning, we really wanted to situate this research in between these sort of in-depth, in-person case studies that have been done on singular leaders, but also on the other end of the spectrum, the sort of broad, large end decapitation studies. And I just want to say at the outset, in focusing on founders and successors, we are not arguing that the counterterrorism efforts should only focus on the leaders. We actually argue that it should be one element in an overall comprehensive counterterrorism approach. In fact, when we think about the case, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, about the second Klan, in which you have extremism that is operating in very close proximity to mainstream society, the sort of more effective counterterrorism measure is something more like the destigmatization of extremism rather than a focus on the leaders themselves. And so one of the things we found was that each of the successors has some weaknesses that could be exploited through counterterrorism measures. So what do I mean by this? So in the case of caretakers, for example, remember caretakers, these are the leaders who are not making dramatic changes to the how or the why. In the case of caretakers, we found that, and we argue that this conservative style of leadership, it could expose an organization to be poorly suited to change, right? To be poorly suited to adapting to rapidly changing circumstance. And so there are opportunities for CT to exploit that, to put pressure on that. I want to talk about fixers, signalers, and visionaries all together, because with each of them, They are making dramatic discontinuous changes to either the how or the why or both. And what I would say taken together is that there are opportunities for all of these leadership styles to highlight their hypocrisy, even to highlight their betrayal of the founders' established frames or that established tactics and resource mobilizations. I would say that signalers, and even more so visionaries, they can be very divisive leadership figures. They can drive a wedge within a group. One of the findings that we had, just as Trish said, when we looked at the broader sample of our many case studies, is that visionaries both reflected divisions in the group and could introduce divisions into the group. And so there are opportunities for CT, for counterterrorism, to exploit those fissures, to drive additional wedges. With regards to figureheads, I mean, this could be a group that is adrift, right? A group that is riven with divisions. And so there may actually be utility for leaving a figurehead in place, despite what we found is the clear sort of policy preference for leadership decapitation. So if we want to go just to the next slide, I want to talk just very quickly about this impact of high versus low counterterrorism pressure. These are obviously pictures of the Second Klan. They did a very famous parade down in Washington, D.C., just a few miles from where I was going to say a few miles from where we're all sitting, a few miles or a few thousand miles from where we all are sitting. It is one of the findings that held true across all the cases that we studied, that the degree of counterterrorism pressure impacted not just the duration of the founder, but also it shapes the operational environment for the successor. Because again, those groups that are operating in low counterterrorism pressure, they have the ability to undertake core activities. They have the ability to plan visible marches on the mall. With contrast, I would say, to the groups that are existing in a high counterterror environment that do not have that freedom of movement and do not have that freedom of activity. So just if we go to the very last slide, I want to say just a very quick thank you, Lisa Manning, who was so remarkable and planned this entire event for us, and to Dr. Young for moderating. But I want to say particularly thank you to the students. I know that we are in arguably the most strenuous part of the fall semester. And so the fact that you are choosing to spend an hour to talk about leadership succession is, I mean, it truly says more about you than it says about us, right? But we're really, really grateful for your time. I have noticed, not for nothing, that the chat has been silent. And my experience with American students is not silence. And so I am surprised by the relative silence. So please do feel free to populate the chat with any questions that you have from us. But I just wanted to say a special thank you to Lisa, to Dr. Young, and to all of you for attending today and for lending us your time and attention.
Well, thank you, professors. That was wonderful. I'll take my moderator prerogative, and I get to ask the first question. And maybe because I like to sort of role play like this, but if you are working in the U.S. government right now, and working on intel matters related to Al Qaeda, and if you could wish for a kind of leader following up on Zawahiri, what's your dream leader who follows Zawahiri? And then on the flip side, if you're in Al Qaeda and you're trying to reconstitute and refigure what your goals are, like what kind of leader do you think they need?
I think going back to my earlier point about Zawahiri being this different leader at different times, he was a fixer at one point, he's a visionary at another point, and then when he takes over at the helm of Al Qaeda, he becomes a caretaker of bin Laden's legacy, and probably at certain times also a figurehead, given the level of counterterrorism focus on locating him. And he is sometimes derided for that as being an ineffective leader. Others argue that that was why Al Qaeda was, for example, able to maintain the alliances that it had with all of its affiliates in the face of the challenge from the Islamic State, which is a remarkable accomplishment in many ways, given how appealing the Islamic State was as a partner at its peak. So can be a lot of debate about whether he was a good leader or not, but what we really focused on is his role as a caretaker. And what I would say at this point is, given Al Qaeda's situation, the weakest option for the organization would either be a figurehead or another caretaker. Neither one of them will be able to revitalize the core organization the way that it could be revitalized given the safe haven it enjoys in Afghanistan, the low counterterrorism environment. And also because the United States has really shifted its focus for many reasons that I actually agree with in terms of its national security priorities. With the focus on China and the declining focus on international counterterrorism in particular, there is not the same appetite for the intensive counterterrorism efforts in South Asia that we once saw. So this is an environment where another caretaker or another or a figurehead would probably leave Al-Qaeda to languish in relative obscurity. On the other hand, I think the most viable option for its revitalization is a visionary, someone who could really revitalize and excite its constituency. But I also think that is a high risk maneuver, given that bin Laden still enjoys such strong status within the movement overall. Interestingly, if you look at the Islamic State, for all the deriding they did of Zawahiri as a leader, they never criticized bin Laden. He still enjoys kind of a status above and beyond. And so it would not be easy for a leader to depart from that foundation. But I think if Al-Qaeda is going to experience a real resurgence, it's going to need that kind of dynamic leadership.
I completely agree with that. The one thing I would add is to say, we were routinely surprised in the course of our research, the number of times in which we would have said, oh, ideally the group should have picked this, right? Like the group should have gone with a fixer to move into that space or to exploit that opportunity. And often the group doesn't, right? The group doesn't necessarily pick. And so I think from our perspective, I think given flagging recruitment, right? Given the need to sort of excite would-be recruits on the global stage, I think a visionary might be what they need, but I don't know that it's necessarily a visionary that they will ultimately choose. And we saw time and time again, the way the groups actually didn't make what we would argue was the sort of the best next step for them.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. The first question, I think, is a blast from the past, coming from Tolu. Do you remember? Are you in Charlottesville, Tolu? I think you are. So that it's great to hear from you. But Tolu is asking, did you study leadership transition after group fractionalization? And do both factions get the same type of new leader?
Tolu, hi, how are you? It's so good to see your name. So the way that we treated splinters was if a faction broke away from the original organization and started a new organization, we treated it as a founder of a new organization. So to give you an example that's apropos of where I'm sitting right now, there was an organization that was a longstanding Pakistani anti-India organization known as Harakat al-Mujahideen. And it was a pretty well-established organization. It was also operative in Afghanistan. One of the senior ideologues was arrested here in India and in prison. So the organization conducted a hijacking to compel his release. It landed in the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan in 1999, and they negotiated for this plane full of hostages for Masood Azhar, who was an ideologue in the organization. And when he came out of prison, he thanked the organization by forming his own and founding a new organization known as Jaish-e-Mohammed, which really eclipsed the original organization. So we treat him as a founder of a new organization at that point, and then analyze the trajectory thereon.
And the key again for us was to mark, just as Tricia said at the beginning, having that duration of a year, right? Making sure that in fact they are able to sort of reconstitute and reestablish. Hello, Tolu, as well. It's so lovely to see your name.
Yeah, that's exciting. And the more recent, not really blast from the past, but we now have a question from Connor Lemke. So he asks, in the context of a group like JNIM, how did the categorizations of each constituent group's leader affect the assessment of the organization as a whole? Is JNIM's existence only possible with a specific set of constituent leaders?
That's an excellent question. And as I was jotting it down, one of the things that it makes me think about is that there were a few cases that we looked at in which we saw sort of umbrella organizations, right? And so I'm thinking about, we did Al-Nusra, right? So there were various places and we looked at the effect of a constituent, right? When you have one constituent entity within an overall leader. And I'm going to go back to the language of the question itself. So how do the categorizations affect the assessment of the organization as a whole? Is their existence only possible within a set of constituent leaders? So we didn't look at Jamaat al-Islam in the context of our case, but I would say that we would apply the exact same criteria to looking at it that we did to the other cases that we did, right? So there were multiple, so I'm thinking of the case of al-Nusra, for example, but there were multiple times in which we looked at several leaders, right? So there was a case where we looked at, Hezbollah was one of the cases in our mini case studies, in which we looked at the effect of having multiple founders over the course of the organization and how that changed. But to my extent, and I don't know if this answers your question, Connor, but I think our exact same framework would apply. So we would look at the exact same categorization. Now, to be clear, and this was one of the points that I think we touched on, but didn't really sort of delve into, we only categorized successors. We did not categorize founders. If anyone is looking for a great sort of honors thesis to do, perhaps, right, or a next project, for our purpose, the founder invests so much into the creation of the how and the why that we didn't categorize them. And also to the point that Dr. Bacon had made in the first several minutes, that founder themselves changed quite significantly over the course of duration. We've talked here at some length about bin Laden. Bin Laden went through multiple iterations, I would argue, of various different organizational styles, leadership archetypes over his very long tenure as a leader. And so, Connor, I don't know if that sort of fully answers your question, but in my mind, being a part of a constituent umbrella organization wouldn't defy categorization. We would see the same sort of categories apply, or archetypes apply. But to be clear, the founder in our mind sort of defied categorization. We didn't. So if any of the 23 people on the call right now are looking for subsequent research projects to do, one of the things, as you all know, that you do in a conclusion to a book is say sort of avenues for future research or avenues for future scholars. And looking at ways in which we could categorize founders, I think, is a really rich and viable area to study for future researchers.
I think that what Dr. Grimm said is exactly right. I think what you would get into when you start talking about JNIM is whether you view it as one umbrella organization or whether you would argue it's an alliance of multiple organizations, and you would categorize each successor accordingly. And I think that of the scholars I know who follow the group closely, they would follow different places on that particular argument. So I think in general, though, in the structure that they've provided, there has been a tendency to at least point one overarching leader, and that's who we typically treat. But those are organizations that are particularly ripe for the kind of splintering that we talked about earlier. And it's also good to see your name, Connor. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, this is nice to see this bit of This Is Your Life. There's some great old faces. So Candace has a question. Our current friend Candace has a question. It's more about, I think, scoping, which is, what are your thoughts on successors in ethno-nationalist, secular, or left-wing groups? Would these terrorist organizations have similar leadership and successor types?
Candace, this is the question. This is awesome. I'm sorry that we didn't make as much a fuss over you as we did the previous two. We can similarly fuss about Candace, right? So part of the reason that Tricia and I chose the scoping of religious terror organizations is because leaders play such a critical role in religious terror organizations, right? Relative to other organizations or even sort of leaderless movements, there is so much invested in the leader of a religious terror organization. And in many times, they actually wear a sort of double hat, right? They are interpreting the religious text for the founder, for the followers, but they are also sort of serving as that role of preacher, that role of prophet. And so they are the ones who really sort of invest the identity within the group. And they are the ones who are interpreting that religious guidance for all of the followers and the would-be followers. And so that's part of the reason for our scoping there. Again, one of the points that we said is, we actually think a great next step for this project would be to see, do these same leadership trends hold? Do these same archetypes hold in organizations in which leaders might not play a central role as they do in religious terror organizations? So for the scope of our project, we did not look at them. So there were questions, for example, we had about even including a group like the Second Klan that exists both as, we would say, a religious terror organization and also a fascistic organization as well. But I think that would be an excellent place for a research project to look at in a movement, so in a left-wing movement, in a right-wing movement, in which leaders are playing less of a central role. Do we see those same founder to successor pathways holding? So Candace, I do not know what year you are. But if you're
Candace is a wonderful PhD student, and so we'd be talking full dissertation here. But I won't do that to you, Candace. I agree with everything that Dr. Grimm said. I think we did deliberately scope this more narrowly than to claim sort of that sweeping cross ideological that this would apply. I think in some of the far left and the far right organizations that don't have this religious orientation, we also see a lot less organization. And so leaders, there may not even really be clear leaders of some of these entities or clear organization. So I think that I think that if you were to ask me my speculation, I would say I think you could see it in some organizations, but it may not apply in others, depending on how they are organized. I will say, on the other hand, we really scratched all the literatures that we could on leadership when we were looking at this. We really tried to dive into leadership literature and everything from, business to sports management to, insurgent movements, you name it. We really ran the gamut in trying to pull from all these different literatures to think about this. So we didn't really just sort of focus narrowly on like a terrorism literature or something like that and trying to craft this theory. We did try to pull from those other places. But I do think that we have, it's an open question as far as we're concerned about how applicable it would be to other kinds of organizations.
Well, and I like the question too, because I was thinking about the same issue of scoping in that it feels to me that this is a more general theory beyond just terrorist organizations, right? This is about organizational change, period. And I loved your answer, hearing you looked at the literature on all these other organizational types. I mean, how much of what you're saying could apply to a business or a sports team or some of these other things? And where would you be like, I'm not very comfortable making that comparison?
I have to tell you, so Tricia heard me say this multiple times, this was an avenue to me that I found so particularly rich. It actually emerged from a conversation that I'd had earlier about the founder of Georgetown and the ways in which subsequent presidents of Georgetown either sort of kept the trains running or to what extent. So for example, when Georgetown is a Jesuit university, when we had our first non-Jesuit president, that's a very significant change in the framing, right? It's a very significant change. And there were multiple constituencies who opposed it. It was a very divisive change that had been taken. And so our argument, and the argument that we believe to our core, is that this is at its most basic point, a theory about religious terrorist leadership. But I think even more importantly than that, it's a theory about leadership. And I think that it could be applied to numerous organizations, numerous groups. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. The ways in which Mike Tomlin as a coach has changed or not, sort of the how and why. One of the things we talk about in the conclusion is that there are some founders who embed so deeply the how and the why that it's very difficult to have successors come after them. And then there are other founders, we talk about the case of Sigmund Freud, right, who sought to craft a true ideological movement with his sort of realm of psychoanalysis, but that sort of broke down with his successors, right? The successors broke with his how and the why, some of them quite publicly and some quite painfully for Sigmund Freud. And so, Joe, I don't know if that's what the challenge is once you sort of, Tricia and I've been working on this project for a very long time. And once you apply this frame, you actually sort of see it everywhere. You see it in organizations. One of the things that we thought about was the case of Microsoft, right? And the ways in which you have a caretaker emerge because the leader was such a sort of seminal figure in that field, in that area. So no, I think it is a theory about leadership. I think it applies to organizations writ large.
I agree. Of course, I agree with what Dr. Grimm articulated there. And at the same time, I sort of end up thinking there is something different about organizations that engage in this kind of violence in the name of religion and that are often, have to give up other relationships, right? This becomes their primary pledge of loyalty. They may have to flee their home. There is also something about these organizations that that made us focus on them in particular. Although I do think the theory that we're articulating, I think you can see echoes of it in a variety of other places. I do have that caveat at the same time in my mind. I have I'm holding contradictory thoughts at the same time on that.
I mean, when my nephew joined the Boy Scouts and told me that the Boy Scouts now let in girls, I screamed and I was like, that's a change in the why. And then my nephew was like, I literally have no idea what you're talking about. But I agree that the violent clandestine nature it is not incidental to the identity, it is the identity. And so I think that that is a central thing of what we're talking about. But when you
Yeah.
look through the lens, you see it everywhere.
Yeah, because I was thinking about this in relation to Apple when you all were talking. I was like doing that whole thing in my head. Well, good. The chat is popping, so I should shut up. But Libby Wallenmeyer, another one of our friends, has a question. Did you find or would you predict a subsequent shift in strength or capabilities that parallels certain successor leadership types more than others?
Hey, Libby, another graduate and dear former student. That's you've tapped into something that in a relationship that has very little strife in it, you have tapped into the one source of strife and that we had in this this project. And it was not because we didn't see it the same way, it was because it was a difficult thing to navigate. And that was how to treat questions of effectiveness. And where, as I alluded to in the beginning, where we came down on this and had to constantly pull ourselves away from were questions of effectiveness. And it's not because we don't think it's important. And it's not actually because we don't think that those questions could be, again, another source of follow-on research. But there was this sort of constant pull to assess whether someone was an effective leader, a good leader, whether it led to a stronger organization. And I think that that is an interesting next step, but we had to, like a founder, we had to establish this baseline first to understand leadership in order to start to explore that question. And we recently actually did start to look through some of these questions, and I don't think we've come to a real clear answer ourselves yet. But I think that what we would say is there is a question of fit. There is a question of fit in the environment and the organization and what a leader is providing. And as Dr. Grimm said, sometimes we'd say this group really needed an X, and that's not what they got. So I think that we did not address that question, and it was a very concerted and I would almost say difficult thing for us to avoid, perhaps because of both of our experience working in this as practitioners in this field. We had that kind of constant question on our minds too. And maybe it's the next step, or maybe as Dr. Grimm said, it's something in very entrepreneurial student who's got a very promising career in this field like Libby can tackle next.
I should also just caveat, Tricia's being very kind. It was always me. I was always the one who moved to add effectiveness, and Tricia would always say, like, no, it's not what we're doing. But I think it's very hard. And I just want to echo what Tricia said. It's very, very hard to do that. So Libby, as Tricia was reading your question, the case that I was thinking about was the case of Hassan Nasrallah as a signaler. And so moving Hezbollah away from just being for Muslims in Lebanon, and instead saying in 2009, no, it's for everyone. And I kept saying, like, what a great move, like what an effective move. And Tricia's like, no, we're not talking about effectiveness. But I do echo, I think it is important to look first simply at the decisions, right? The decisions that are made without that question then about, were they effective? Because for us, that question of measuring became almost impossible.
All right, we got a couple other questions. We'll see if we can get to both of them, or if we have to maybe do a lightning round at some point. But Ellis, our good friend Ellis, also he asks, in your research, did you find the relationship of the successor to the founder had an effect on their successor pathway?
Ellis, this was one of the animating questions for us. Absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to take as a for example, the pathway that we saw it the most, and that is the founder to caretaker. And so generally what we found is that often the caretaker has the legitimacy that they have the prestige they have, the authority they have, because in direct relationship to their relationship with the founder. So an excellent case study for this is the relationship between Ayman al-Zawahiri and bin Laden, to be sure. I mean, in which Zawahiri derives so much of his authority and his legitimacy from his relationship, his very long-standing relationship with bin Laden. We also saw, quite frankly, that when there are familial bonds, so passing down from a brother or from a father to a son, almost always these were caretakers, right? Because this sort of familial identity, the familial authority is passed down. I will say, and I'm referencing now at 12:55, this is the second sports reference that I will make, but this is the dynamic that we found that also transcends just terrorism studies. So one of our longtime RAs texted me during an NFC championship game in which the big sort of blurb that was put up was effectively a coaching tree, right? All of the super winning head coaches that had studied, that had worked under San Francisco 49ers coach Bill Walsh, excuse me. And so what we found is that this is a similar thing, that this relationship, a familial relationship, sort of almost paternalistic relationship, is what gives that successor authority. We saw this in the case, there had been a piece out about all of the chefs that had trained under Alice Waters, who's the sort of longstanding famous chef of Chez Panisse. And so this is the idea that these relationships, these confer identity, they confer legitimacy. And so in our assessment, these tended to be the caretakers, these ones that had these familial bonds or these relational bonds.
I would actually say this is the fewest sports references that she's made in a talk that we've given. So it's actually where the only thing I would add to that, I agree with everything that Dr. Grimm said, was one of the other ways that we saw it was in the Al-Shabaab case, where we had a founder who anointed his successor. And then his successor was a fixer. He did make tactical changes, but he didn't experience a lot of internal strife as a result. And I think that was in part because he was anointed in this way from the founder, that he wasn't seen as rejecting the founder's foundation and making these tactical changes. He was seen as responding to the environment. And so I think it, in some cases, also enabled them to make changes when they had a close relationship with the founder and not have them be too divisive.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Before we get to that question, though, I want to ask where can you get the book? Is it on Columbia University Press's site? Do you have a special code just for the people here who are here, or anything good like that?
Yeah. Oh, I'm not on mute.
That would be nice, right? Okay, well,
we do have a code. We do have a code. Yes.
All right, so we can figure that out. But I imagine people will want to get a copy. It's beautiful, and will you sign it too for folks if they want to have it signed? Because I know I'll need my copy signed. So
I just want to follow up. You can absolutely get it on Columbia. We could actually do a quick dig and find the promotional code, and we could send it out. I don't know if there's a way to do that. Either Lisa could do that, or Trish could do that. You can get it from Columbia University Press's site. You can also get it from Amazon. I am told it makes a good holiday present, birthday present, fourth night of Hanukkah present. So all of these things are available.
Okay, awesome. So last question comes from Maylee, our good friend Maylee, and she says lots of nice things, but I'm going to skip that. Which then, not sure if I'm phrasing this well, but did you find dynamics where interpersonal conflicts and strategic disagreement between leaders resulted in further shifts or changes in leadership styles of these individuals, such as the AQ and IS split?
I was going to tackle this really quickly. I know that we're almost out of time. So we certainly saw this. So some cases it manifests in splintering, right? The groups fully splinter and separate. The case that I think about a lot, mainly when I see this question, is the case of the Klan, right? So there was widespread interpersonal divisiveness between the successor, between Evans and the founder Simmons, largely because Simmons had positioned the group to sort of live up to this high moral code, right? This high moral standard as befitting members of the Klan. And he himself did not personally live up to that. So there's a high degree of interpersonal divisiveness between the two. But I don't know, Tricia, if you want to say a very quick sort of 30-second response before the Zoom ends.
I mean, how many years into this are we still talking on mute and then talking also when you're unmuted and don't mean to? Yes, and I think that was actually one of the core things that we found when we did this initial exploration of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. We argued that it wasn't the tactical differences and the strategic strife, that those things had existed all along. What changed was some of these leadership dynamics, in particular, Zawahiri's lacking ability to handle conflict, which was pervasive in all of his different leadership variations. So yes, those kinds of factors definitely do play a role. And the other thing that I would say is those are sometimes the hardest things for us to know. When you get into cases of succession, there were plenty of cases where people succeeded that, even when I was in the intelligence community, were relatively unknown to us. And so some of those interpersonal dynamics can be particularly hard to put your finger on. And that's probably a limitation of this kind of research too, is really understanding some of those.
Well, thanks, Professors Bacon and Grimm. This has been a fantastic talk. When you were talking about trees, it feels like some of your tree is here, which is also kind of lovely. We're grateful for the people coming out, and thank you.
Thank you
And-
all so much.
Yes, thank you so much. I was searching my email and I promise you, I will find that promotional code and send that to you all. I'm happy. We're both happy to sign the book for you. As I say, we're going to have an in-person launch at the end of January. So you're welcome to come there and have a toast at the same time. And I do appreciate seeing so many of you who have been former students or who I haven't gotten to see while I've been on sabbatical. It's really lovely for you to come. And I look forward to seeing all of you when I return.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon and have a great break.